What part does purpose play in the overall success of any organisation? Welcome to the Alchemy of Alignment. I'm Suzy Sanders. I'm your ever curious host. And today, Pete Cooper is joining us to open this conversation. Pete's an author, a speaker, and an organisational development consultant. And full disclosure, Pete and I go many years back. So let's see where this conversation goes. Pete, thank you so much for making space for us today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. You're welcome. Looking forward to it.
Now, I didn't do your introduction any justice because I know there's a lot more to you than the labels that I've mentioned. So would you like to just expand on what you're all about for the people that perhaps aren't familiar with you?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So I think there's three main parts to how I spend my time. As you've said, so an author, first of all. So my book, The Better Human Blueprint, came out in October 2024. And that's a book about how you can find fulfillment in your personal and professional life. It fundamentally brings together lots of academic insights across a wide range of topics and tries to translate it into practical, actionable tips and advice for people. That's been a huge piece of work for the last couple of years. It's been an absolute passion project. So really pleased to see that out there. The organisational development consultant stuff, that's the sort of the label I go for, but I'm very aware to a lot of people, organisational development doesn't mean anything. It didn't mean anything to me, probably even maybe 5 years ago. I had a vague idea, but effectively I describe what I do as the fun part of HR. So I look at how organisations work, how people work, coming from sort of learning and development training, thinking about the cultures, the ways of working to get organisations and people working to the best of their abilities. And the sort of third strand of what I do, I'm a chairperson of a local hockey club. So sport has always been a big part of my life and continues to be. So I still play, I umpire, and contribute to the club and the community in that way.
Amazing, Pete. Thank you so much for expanding on that. And congratulations on the book, because I firmly believe everyone has a book in them. Cliche, but true.
Yeah.
And I know what goes into creating a book and putting it out there in the world, and particularly when it is something that you're clearly very passionate and is close to your heart. I know the kind of intricacies in there. So hats off to you for actually making that happen. And I presume it's been very well received. I'm still waiting for my signed copy, I must admit, but that's okay.
In the post. Yeah, it's gone down well. Thank you. The reviews are starting to come in, which is really really helpful, and starting to get really nice feedback, which is good to see. We had the book launch a little while ago, and that also went down really well. So yeah, really excited now to see it out there. It's that really vulnerable moment of it's arguably writing it's the easy part because no one else is looking at it at that point. Although I had people reading it throughout, but it's out there for the world to see. In a weird way, I'm looking forward to the first negative review because I can't wait to see someone who's going to get worked up enough to challenge me on what my thinking is, and that's a lot of what I've tried to do with the book is put some thoughts out there to challenge thinking. And I say in there, look, well, you're not going to agree with everything I say, and that's great because the point is to provoke conversations, similar to some of the things we're doing today. So yeah, but so far so good.
Oh, I love that you've mentioned that, Pete. I mean, the word that stuck out there for me was vulnerability, because I remember when I put my first book out there, I had a what I will call an emotional hangover for about 3 weeks. I was just like, oh my goodness, what have I done? People are going to think that I'm like, what is this? Like, is it helpful? And all of that kind of stuff. Doubt was kicking up with me, and so I'm sure everybody experiences that when they're putting something out there in that way, but particularly that you're trying to challenge and invoke like critical thinking and opinion. And I absolutely applaud that. And I understand that process very painfully well. So before we get kind of stuck in this conversation about the book, I've invited you here today to ask you the question, what part purpose plays in the success of an organization? So let's have it, Pete. What's your take?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I was was looking for the stat for this the other day, and I can't find it. But there's millions of stats on it. But I'll be honest. Early on in my career, I thought that the purpose, vision, values was all sort of soft and fluffy stuff that we didn't really worry about, and it kind of got in the way. I'll be really transparent about that. Um, and it wasn't until I started getting stuck into more the organizational development stuff that I started to go, okay, well, maybe there's something to it. And then I think it was a Gallup um, stat that really resonated with me, which was that only 30% of people understood their organizational purpose. And that really resonated. And as I say, the reason I mentioned the sports side of things is because I usually end up aligning stuff to sport. And the equivalent there is saying, okay, so only 30% of people understand their organisational purpose. That's the equivalent of only 3 people in a football team knowing where the goal is. And you kind of you think about it like that, and it's like, well, you're just not going to win. It's that simple. If only 3 people in your team, and if anyone's watching questioning my maths, just give me the grace that 3 out of 11 is going to be close enough to 30% there, please. 3 people only knowing, if only 3 people know where the goal is, you aren't going to win. It's that simple. And that kind of provoked in me that, well, actually, it's the single most important thing a business needs to know. Because if you don't know your purpose, you don't know how you're going to win, you don't know what you're playing, and often you're not even going to know what game you're playing, let alone anything else. So that's what started it. And then I think for me, there's kind of, as I've developed in this field and worked with teams, worked with organizations, read a lot about it, there's obviously so much that goes into it. But I grouped it into 3 things. And that is that purpose plays a role in the success of an organization because it guides and directs the organization. It attracts and retains colleagues to work for that organization, and then it motivates and engages people. So those sort of the 3 things that it plays a part of this success for me. And it's that piece around, even more so now than 20, 30 years ago, that people are choosing to join, to invest, to work with, to buy from organizations that they understand, share, buy into that purpose. So yeah, it's gone from, for me, being something that's soft and fluffy through to what I think is probably the single most important thing an organization can have.
Oh, thank you, Pete. I couldn't agree more, and I love that use of the football team there. And yeah, if you've only got 3 people who don't know where the goal is, like, you obviously got lots of issues. That's a really great way of putting it. And I'm interested because I know your experience. You mentioned there you're working with teams, larger organizations, and my more recent experience is working with kind of solo entrepreneurs, smaller startup businesses. And I'm not shy. I'm all about the purpose. That's why this podcast exists.
Yeah.
The importance of it. I agree with you wholeheartedly with those three things that you mentioned and what it impacts. And I'm wondering what your take is on, for a startup business or a smaller business who has got to wear all the hats, they've got to do all the things, they've got to be everything to everyone, and where where does purpose fit in with that in a smaller business, from your take?
Yeah, I think it's huge, right? Because if you don't have that purpose, I don't see how you're going to have the energy to keep going. And on those hard days, especially in those situations when as you've described, you're giving everything to it, right? Especially if you're by yourself, if you don't have that core purpose that's driving you, and you often purpose is described as the fire that never goes out, right? So actually, when you're exhausted, when you're doing stuff, and I think it's probably more important in the situation you described, because you're, like you say, you're wearing many hats. So the chances are you're going to be doing things that you don't love. So if you're a creative entrepreneur, I'm going to hazard a guess that doing your accounts isn't going to be the thing that potentially gets you up in the morning, but it's going to be critical for running your business. And actually, if you can tie that activity back to, without doing this, I can't achieve my purpose, that's going to be that fire that keeps you going through it. And I think as you grow from, in some ways, purpose is easy when it's just you because you get it, right? But then it becomes 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20, you have to work on communicating that purpose, because it's really easy for one person to know the decisions they would make because they're the one making them. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying all decisions are easy, but I'm saying it's not hard. You don't have to spend the time thinking, oh, what would such and such do? Because you are the such and such. But as you grow, decision making will slow down because people will spend their time thinking, well, if such and such was in the room, so if yourself, if Suzy was in the room, what would Suzy do? But actually, communicating that purpose is the way of saying, if you can make decisions aligned to that purpose, that's what I would do. So that's where I think it comes from. It's that it's driving you forward through the times when it's hard. Maybe the money's not coming in or whatever, and actually you need that thing. So for me, with the book, like I said, that passion project, I had very clearly, I knew why I was doing it, and I knew the people I was doing it for. So when I hit the sort of Cantor's law, when I hit that messy middle, I was able to go, no, I'm not giving up because I know exactly why I'm doing this. So yeah, I think there's two parts to that.
Oh, thank you, Pete. And you're so right. Like when it is a smaller business, smaller organization, so many things are easier in the sense of decision making, action, communicating, course correcting. When it's just a smaller number of people, those things are naturally very easy. And actually, that's one of the advantages. So, what are some of the challenges that you have experienced, seen, witnessed with larger organizations in communicating that purpose? Because I feel like communication is a huge thing here. And firstly, there's knowing the importance, knowing the purpose, and then being able to articulate that. Like, what are some of the common pitfalls that you think are worth discussing?
Yeah, there's loads, right?
Big question.
I think the core one, um, and if you take back to early 20s me who thought it was soft and fluffy, um, it's the fact that often a purpose is just words on a page that become motivational posters in boardrooms, and they sit on our screensavers. And you're told on day one, well, no, usually if you're doing your sort of interview prep right, you've read on the company website what the purpose is, and you can go into your interview and you can say what the purpose is, what the values are, and they're probably hammered into you in your induction, um, and then they're never spoken about ever again. And again, they become maybe a coaster, because that was the latest great thing, to be like, here's our purpose, here's our values, but they're not lived. So I'd say even before communicating it, it's living the purpose that is the biggest challenge for big organisations, um, and that's what you absolutely have to go to in terms of, right, what does the purpose do? It guides us. So how do we track that right down through embedding it into organizations? And the same with values. So you can see companies that have spent time on their values, and you can see companies that haven't. And often, a company's values, if a company's set of values for me are trust, honesty, integrity, inclusion. Let's pick four. I've probably nailed about 80% of companies' values right there, because they're good things to do. Now, inclusion, don't get me wrong, that's an absolutely critical one, and it needs to be embedded. I've done quite a lot of work in the diversity, equity, inclusion space. But what those four words are telling me is, have you done any work on your values, or have you just gone to a dictionary and picked four words that feel like they're quite good to put on a company website? But then you've got companies who actually have spent time tailoring them to their organization. So I was looking at a company website recently. Um, I was looking at a couple of company websites, and I was thinking about job hunting, and there was a racing company, and there was things like, I can't remember what it was, but putting the customer on the podium, for instance. So it's just something like that shows they've thought about it and embedded it into the core of what they do. So the easy one, putting the customer first. Everyone should be putting the customer first, but actually in our context, now that shows to me a company spent some time on what does it actually mean.
Mm.
Um, so I think there's that. And if I stick with, so that's living the power. So if I stick with defining it, there's a few bits there around making sure it's an infinite purpose, and making sure it's for something, not against something. So they're the two. And the example I always use here, again going back to sport, is the New Zealand All Blacks. So the most successful sports team of all time, pretty much. Their purpose, you'd think, right, sports team, it's probably going to be something about winning, beating the opposition. New Zealand All Black purpose is to leave the shirt in a better place. It's that simple. And it's perfect because it's an infinite purpose. It's never going to be completed. It's not full of jargon, and it's for something. So having a purpose that's against something is great in a crisis, but it's not going to be sustained. So there's that. And then, yes, communicating is important. I think beyond that, it's embedding. So embedding it into practices. So we talk about, if you look at performance management, for instance, or you look at team development, how embedded into those values and behaviors, how embedded in your culture is that? And one of the challenges, I think, with that is, as a team, can you have separate values to your organization? How does that work? Because you have two almost separate organizations going on there. And I think for me, this is when you look at how you take values and operationalize them. So what does that actually mean in my context? Um, I was at risk of going off on too much of a tangent there, but hopefully that
Oh,
answers the question.
thank you, Pete. I think there's no risk there. You could. I think I could listen to you speak about this for all day. And there's so many things that you've sparked off in my mind just hearing you speak about that. And it's so fascinating, isn't it? That kind of concept of the infinite purpose. And I know some of the threads that have come up in previous episodes, there's this kind of very individual, oh, but I feel like it's something I have to achieve or do or tick off the list. And it's like, guys, I've had wonderful, incredible people worried about coming to speak to me because they feel like they haven't got it nailed yet. And I'm like, it's not, that's not how it works. It is this kind of infinite purpose. And what I'm hearing from you there, it's about this embodiment and embedding and actually living that purpose. And that can sometimes be, even for the individual, let alone the organization, it can sometimes be a really tricky thing to recognize and to navigate. And I'm wondering if you would be comfortable sharing with us maybe one or two things that you found helpful in that living your purpose. You've mentioned obviously the kind of messy middle with the book, and are there any specific examples you'd be comfortable sharing that help you live your purpose?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's two. So if I pick one that's very much about how my purpose has helped my decision making, and then I can talk to one very recent about my values effectively. So you're totally right. Yeah, for me, you don't complete your purpose. That's something you work towards. So I think quite early on in my career, I was thinking about doing a master's. I knew I wanted to do a master's, um, and I was trying to decide between doing a forensic psychology master's or an occupational psychology master's. So both psychology, that's my background. Um, and I was umming and ahhing. I had experience, interest in both. So I'd done my university work placement year in a forensic psychology placement. I was a qualified sports coach at this time, and I knew that it's quite interesting taking coaching into business. Um, but it was really tough to know which to decide or which one to decide on. And that was at a time I had not really ever thought about defining my purpose. And I had no sort of decision making framework or anything to really relate it back to. So I remember going through all the sort of different elements, which, knowing what I know now, I was effectively working through my Ikigai without knowing it under the Ikigai label. And I ended up deciding that occupational psychology was the one for me because I felt it had better job prospects. I think, like, reflecting on that, had I known, had I spent the time sort of discovering, developing my purpose, it would have been a really simple decision because I could have looked at it and gone, right, how do I see my purpose? And does which one gets me closer to it? And I think that's the thing we talk about not completing, but we can certainly make decisions aligned to that. Um, and so I define my purpose now, and it's gone through quite a few iterations. So to pursue better in myself and others, so that we can achieve more than we ever thought possible. So if I look at that and think, actually, occupational psychology, that gets me closer to that pursuing better myself and others. Now, you could argue that forensic psychology might get me there as well. And yeah, there is something in that, but that one felt better compared to a decision a couple of years later. And I was doing, and I talk about both of these actually as an example I use in my book, so maybe I need a different example. But when I was doing my hockey umpiring, I was looking at potentially going up to a higher level of umpiring myself or starting to take on the development of umpires at my local club. And I knew that I couldn't do both at the same time because I couldn't be in two places at once. It's as simple as that. And that was a really easy decision because I knew that what I was interested in is pursuing better now in myself and others. Um, it was that development of others that I really felt played out stronger for me. So it was quite an easy decision to say, right, I am going to focus on developing the club, the club umpires, people around me, so that as a group we can achieve more. And that's played out really well for me and for the club, hopefully. Um, so that's where that knowing that purpose made it a really simple decision. And then really recently, so obviously for me, purpose, I then link values and behaviours into that. So one of my core values, and I know there's loads of debate about how many values you should have. I sit on the sort of 2 or 3 being the right sort of number. I think if you have too many, then it's not really values. You're just listing a long list of things. But I have authenticity as one of my core values. And I was in a situation at work recently where I started a job not that long ago, not particularly happy, but I was looking at the options sort of when I was talking to my current work. I have an option to try and explore a different part of the business and get stuck in there. And I thought that sounded positive, so I was going to explore that option. But I'd already started exploring external jobs as well. Um, and so I felt I was at a position where I was having a conversation with people in certain parts of the organisation about getting involved in projects in their part of the business, really putting myself out there, getting stuck in. But at the same time, even that evening, I was then having a chat to a recruiter about an external job. And I was just looking at that thinking, I am doing something that conflicts with my values. And I'm not going to take credit for it, but I also can't tell you who first said it because I just don't know. But the phrase of value is not a value until it costs you something. And my value has cost me something. So currently, I've resigned because I don't feel that I can authentically do both things. So don't have anywhere to go at the moment, but exploring that, okay, I'm confident I will find something. And who knows, that might be that actually that forces me to focus, have some more conversations internally, and I stay. Um, but yeah, those couple of examples for me show that actually how your purpose can really, really guide some of those decisions. And I think that's a very personal layer, but you can apply exactly that into teams and organizations that when you're thinking about those decisions, you can, by having that clear guiding principle, that guiding compass, you can then look back on and go, well, which decision, which outcome is going to get us closer to what we're trying to achieve.
Oh, thank you, Pete, and some really, really helpful and interesting insights into your personal decision making. And thank you for sharing that quite open, honest tale of how that misalignment you felt. I think you used the word felt quite a lot there in terms of what's important to you, what your values are, what the purpose is, but there was this feeling of, hang on, this isn't right for me right now. And
Yeah.
the courage that it's taken to explore that, to communicate that, and to almost, is it fair to say you're fully trusting the process with it, in the sense of, you mentioned nothing lined up, nothing firmed up, but you're allowing it to flow, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, fully trusting the process. That's exactly it. We'll see what happens, certainly.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Pete. And I've got to be so careful now because I could talk to you about these topics for such a long time, but we do keep these episodes brief. And I feel like I need to I mentioned at the start of this episode that we go way back. And I feel like I just want to touch on that, if I may. I'm not going to
Yeah,
reveal
sure.
any dirty secrets. Sorry. On my part, that is, I have to say. But Pete and I used to work together long before I started Alchemy Virtual Assistants, before I started my business. And I feel like that was almost a different version of me that you knew, Pete. And I know your journey has, evolved so much in the years that have passed as well. So I feel like I just need to recognize that, because it's wonderful that we've been able to come back together today and have this conversation after such a bit. I can't even put a year on it. How many years has it been?
It's been a while, certainly, hasn't it? I'm going to say 7 or 8 years sort of territory would be my gut. Um,
Yeah, and obviously we've spoken and chatted
yes,
before, but it feels like a really nice thing for us to be able to come back together and have this conversation here today.
definitely.
Um, you've mentioned so much gold today, and a few of the things that kind of stood out for me. I'm going to requote you, and we'll perhaps find out where that came from. But a value isn't a value until it costs you something. That feels really quite profound and inspiring, in the sense of fueling that fire and the motivation, right? It's This work isn't easy, personally, collectively. Would you agree, Pete?
Yeah, massively. Yeah, I think that's huge. Absolutely. It's not about running around trying to be a martyr or anything like that. But it's recognizing that your values, your purpose, they're huge. They're critical. It's guiding how you live your life, and that is, it's not easy to find that, discover that, and live according to that.
Yeah. So if you're listening and you're thinking, I really have got so much to figure out, don't worry. We all have, right? This is the beautiful, messy part of being a human. And as a closing thought, Pete, if someone is listening today thinking they're inspired and they're fueled by this conversation, if they were to go and do one thing that would make them feel closer to their purpose, what would you invite them to do?
I think for me, I'd encourage you to check my book out. And the reason I say that is because I've put a lot of practical examples in there that are going to help you shape your purpose, identify your values, and really apply the kind of things we're talking about. So if you're sat here going, I don't quite know what my purpose is, then there's stuff in there for you. That's exactly what I've done. And or I don't know what my values are, or I lead a team and I don't know how I'd shape that culture, then there's a chapter on that, in terms of, all right, how do I bring my team along in this journey to shape it? And I know I've used the wonderful HRE language of going on a journey, but it is for a team. So yeah, I'd encourage you to check out the Better Human Blueprint.
Oh, thank you so much, Pete. And we'll pop a link in so you can check out Pete's book. And I'm so grateful to you for being here today. This is the Alchemy of Alignment podcast. I'm Suzy Sanders. I would love to know what has landed and resonated most with you today from this conversation. Pete, thanks again for so freely sharing your insights. And we will be back with another episode soon. Thank you for being here.